If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. I need to give you a quick content warning. In this episode, I mention suicide, and there's some pretty gruesome violence, and there's also some sexual content. In the episode, I give you a little heads up before I start talking about the gruesome violence, but I will leave a timestamp in the episode description for when I start talking about the gruesome violence, and I will also leave timestamps for the other content warnings in case there's anything that you want to skip over. Well, alright, now let's get into the episode. This episode has a little bit of everything in it. A treasonous plot to overthrow a government? Check. A scheme to get a king out of massive debt? Check. Religious turmoil? Check. A king's young, hot, sexy lover? Check. The scandalous murder plot that said king's lover, the lover's wife, and maybe even the king himself was involved in? Also check. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 7th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that, during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So, while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about King James VI and First. Again. This is King James VI and First Part 3. So obviously there was a Part 1 and there was a Part 2. And I recommend you listening to those episodes first if you haven't already. If you have listened to those episodes, but you need a recap, don't worry, I got you. I understand if you have forgotten some details that happened in Part 1 and Part 2. I can't tell you everything that happened in those episodes, but I'm going to tell you the important details. So, the recap. James was the son of Mary Queen of Scots and Lord Darnley. Lord Darnley was murdered when James was a baby. Mary Queen of Scots may have had something to do with his murder. Mary was forced to abdicate, and James became the King of Scotland when he was 1 year old. He never saw his mother again. James was raised a Protestant, even though both of his parents were Catholic. One of his lovers may have been a man by the name of Esme Stuart. James wanted to be the King of England, so he made peace with England, even though Queen Elizabeth I executed his mother. James became the King of England after Elizabeth died. James wanted to combine both Scotland and England and make them one country. Both Scotland and England were like, no dude, we don't want that. So that didn't happen. At first, England was happy to have James as their king, but the honeymoon phase didn't last long, and people started to try to figure out ways to get James off of the throne, or at the very least to get him to be more sympathetic to Catholics. There was the by-plot that tried that. Then there was the main plot that was happening at the same time as the by-plot. The main plotters wanted to kill James. Both of those plots were found out about, and a lot of people were punished. Most of them were executed. Then there was the Gunpowder Plot. Robert Catesby, John Wright, Christopher Wright, Robert Winter, Thomas Percy, Guy Fawkes, John Grant, Ambrose Rockwood, Sir Edward Digby, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, and Francis Tresham were the men that were behind the Gunpowder Plot. Their plan was to blow up Parliament, killing James and other Protestants. William Parker was a Catholic member of Parliament, and he got a letter from someone that warned him about the plot. He took that letter to Robert Cecil, who was James's Secretary of State, and Robert knew that there was something that was going to go down, but he wasn't sure about the who and the what. Robert Catesby found out that William Parker had been warned, and he thought Francis Tresham may have been the one that warned him, so he and Thomas Winter had a talk with Francis. Francis told them that he did not send the letter to William, but that they should abandon the plan since someone knew about it. And that is where we left off last week. So now let's get started with part 3. So James had been off hunting, unbeknownst to him, with a man that wanted him dead because he was hunting with Robert Catesby. And he returned to London on November 1st, 1605. Robert Cecil showed him the letter, and James felt like it had something to do with fire and powder. Of course, Robert had already figured that part out, but he played dumb to make James feel smart and to stroke his ego, which I feel tells us a lot about who James was as a person. Because of this letter, the Lord Chamberlain, Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, searched the Houses of Parliament both above and below. On November 3rd, Thomas Percy, Robert Catesby, and Thomas Winter had their final meeting. On November 4th, Edward Digby joined a, quote, hunting party at Dunchurch so he could abduct Princess Elizabeth. Thomas Percy visited Henry Percy to see if he had heard anything about the letter that was sent to William Parker, and the information that he got from Henry eased his mind, and he told Thomas Winter, John Wright, and Robert Keyes that they all had nothing to worry about. Then Robert Catesby, John Wright, and Thomas Bates went to the Midlands. Robert Keyes gave Guy Fawkes a pocket watch that Thomas Percy gave to him to time the fuse. Then Ambrose Rockwood picked up several engraved swords. Also, on November 4th, the undercroft beneath the House of Lords was searched and firewood was found. They also found Guy there. He told them that the firewood belonged to his master, Thomas Percy. This caused them to be concerned because Thomas was known to be a Catholic agitator. James wanted a more thorough search to be done, so they all went back to the undercroft at night, and Guy was found again. This time, He was dressed in a cloak, hat, boots, and spurs. He was arrested, and he gave him his name as being John Johnson. The lantern that John Johnson, was carrying is now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Guy's person was searched, and they found the pocket watch, several slow matches, and torchwood. 36 barrels of gunpowder was found in the undercroft. In the early morning of November 5th, Guy was taken to James. It didn't take long before the news of John Johnson hit the streets of London and made its way into the ears of the rest of the plotters. Christopher Wright and Thomas Percy left London together. Then Ambrose Rockwood fled 30 miles in just 2 hours on one horse. He first ran into Robert Keyes and then into Christopher Wright and Thomas Percy. The gang then ran into Robert Catesby, John Wright, and Thomas Bates. The group continued northwest to Dunchurch. Edward Digby had provided them with their getaway horses. Robert Keyes went to Henry Mordaunt, 4th Baron Mordaunt's house in Drayton. Thomas Winter stayed in London. He even went to Westminster to see what was going on. He left as soon as he found out just what was going on. He traveled on horseback to his sister's house in Norfolk, and then he headed to Huntingdon Court. The gang was together, and they stopped at Ashby St. Ledger's. That was where Robert Winter was. They met him, and they filled him in on what was going down. Then they went to Dunchurch and met with Edward Digby. Robert Catesby wasn't ready to fully give up on the plot, so he told the, quote, hunting party that James and Robert Cecil were dead. He still believed that they could do the revolt part of the plot. The fugitives then went to Warwick. Extra guards were put at the city gates, and they closed the ports and protected the Spanish ambassador. His house was surrounded by an angry mob. An arrest warrant was issued for Thomas Percy. Henry Percy was put under house arrest. While all this was going on, Guy Fawkes was being interrogated, and he didn't quickly spill the beans. He actually impressed James with his ability to maintain his composure. James said he possessed a, quote, Roman resolution. The only thing that he revealed during his first interrogation was the name of his mother and the fact that he was from Yorkshire. A letter to Guy Fawkes was found on his person, but he said that that was one of his aliases. Remember, he still was telling them that his name was John Johnson. He also told them that he was acting alone. The Lord Chief Sir John Popham questioned Ambrose Rockwood's servants. John had a hatred for Catholics. He got the names of Robert Catesby, Robert Keyes, Thomas Winter, John Wright, Christopher Wright, John Grant, and Ambrose Rockwood. Guy Fawkes was moved to the Tower of London because James had ordered for him to be tortured. This is what James wrote in a letter, quote, the gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, and thus by steps extended to the bottom depths. And so God speed your good work, end quote. It is possible that Guy was hung from the wall in manacles, but we know for sure that he was put on the rack. On November 7th, 1605, Guy confessed. Now, the ones on the run raided Warwick Castle for supplies, then made their way to Norfolk for weapons. Then they went to Huntingdon. Thomas Bates went to go deliver a letter to Father Henry Garnet from Robert Catesby that was asking for help in raising an army. If you remember, Henry Garnet was the priest that Robert Catesby had went to and asked if the Gunpowder Plot would be excused by God. Henry was like, I told you no. I told you that I didn't want to have anything to do with this plot. He told Thomas Bates that they needed to stop their, quote, wicked actions, and then Henry took off. Other priests were worried about their colleagues, so they headed for Warwick. They were caught and imprisoned in London. The fugitives were struggling to find support from anyone because no one wanted to go down for treason. They spread out some wet gunpowder near a fire to dry it out, and a spark from the fire landed on the gunpowder. Robert Catesby, Ambrose Rockwood, John Grant, and someone named Morgan were burned. Morgan was a part of the, quote, hunting party. Again, the universe was trying to speak to them, and they wouldn't listen. Thomas Winter and one of the gang's followers, Stephen Littleton, who had tried and failed to get support from Robert Winter's father-in-law, John Talbot, were told that Robert Catesby had died. So Stephen took off, but Thomas continued on and found out that Robert was scorched, but still alive. John Grant was blinded by the fire. A lot of the plotters took off. Robert Catesby, John Grant, John Wright, Christopher Wright, Ambrose Rockwood, Thomas Percy, Thomas Winter, and Morgan were all that remained. I don't have much information on Morgan. I don't know if that's a surname or if that's a first name. I couldn't find out a lot of information on them. They all knew that they had been defeated, so they just decided to wait for the king's men to come and find them. They were caught on November 8th, 1605. Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy were shot and killed instantly. John Wright and Christopher Wright were shot, and they probably would have survived had they received medical treatment, but instead of that, their bodies were stripped and they were left for dead. Thomas Winter was shot in his shoulder. Ambrose Rockwood was also shot, but he survived. John Grant, Ambrose Rockwood, Thomas Winter, and Morgan were all arrested. Thomas Bates and Robert Keyes were then caught. Edward Digby was going to hang himself, but he was caught before he could. Francis Tresham was arrested on November 12th, 1605, and he was taken to the Tower of London on November 15th. Other Catholics were rounded up and taken to the Tower as well. Catholics that had nothing to do with the Gunpowder Plot. Catholics including Henry Percy, who was taken to the Tower on November 27th. In fact, the only things that the Gunpowder Plot managed to successfully achieve was to make life harder for Catholics in England and make those loyal to James even more loyal to him. Because of the plot, persecution of Catholics in England increased. The houses of the plotters were, of course, searched. Mary Digby, the wife of Edward Digby, had her house ransacked and she was made destitute. Henry Garnet, remember, he was the priest that the plotters, especially Robert Catesby, kept trying to get involved in the plot. He sent a letter to the Privy Council telling them that he was innocent. Every Catholic did what they could to distance themselves from the plotters. Foreign powers even called them atheists and Protestant heretics. For about 10 weeks, Sir Edward Coke interrogated the plotters. Edward has shown up in, I know, at least one other episode of History Shelf. I think it was the Queen Elizabeth I episode, though I could be wrong. But anyway, in the first round of interrogations, no one was tortured, though torture was threatened. On June 27, 1606, Henry Percy was charged with contempt. He was stripped of all public offices and he was fined £30,000. That is about £7 million in today's money. And Henry wasn't released from the Tower until June of 1621. So he was imprisoned for 16 years and he probably had nothing to do with the plot. Anthony Maria Brown, 2nd Viscount Montague, and Lord Stourton were Catholic members of Parliament that were rounded up and arrested. They were condemned to imprisonment in the Tower after being tried in the Star Chamber. They remained in the Tower until 1608, and then they were moved to Fleet Prison. They were also fined. Dudley Carleton was imprisoned for a little bit in the Tower. He was the one that had leased the vault where the gunpowder was stored. He was released, though, because Robert Cecil believes that he was innocent. Thomas Bates confessed on December 4th, 1605. In his confession, he implicated Father Oswald Tesimond in the plot. On July 13th, 1606, he said that he had visited Henry and Oswald on November 7th to tell them that the plan had failed. He also told them about a meeting between Henry Oswald and John Gerald in October of 1605. While that was going on, Francis Treshman's health was going down. He died of strangury on December 23rd, 1606. Francis said that Henry Garnet was involved with the 1603 mission to Spain to get them to invade England, but right before he died, he recanted. He never brought up the letter to William Parker in his confession. His body was buried in the Tower of London, and his head was put on a spike either at Northampton or London Bridge, and his estates were confiscated. On January 9th, 1606, Robert Winter and Stephen Littleton were captured. They were being hidden by Humphrey Littleton. A cook turned them in. Humphrey took off, but he was captured, and he was hanged, drawn, and quartered on April 7th, 1606. On January 15th, 1606, a proclamation named Father Henry Garnet, Father John Gerald, and Father Oswald Tesimond as wanted men. Oswald and John were able to flee the country, and they were never caught. On January 24th, 1606, the Jesuit priests Nicholas Owens, Ralph Ashley, and Edward Oldcorn were arrested. On January 26th, Humphrey had told authorities where they could find Father Henry Garnet. He did that because he hoped that he could trade that information for his friend's freedom. By the time that authorities came for Henry, he was tired of running, so he came out of hiding. Guy Fawkes said that Henry Garnet had nothing to do with the plot, but that was omitted from the trial. Edward Cook said that the Jesuit priests were the ones that had come up with the plot, and he was the one that said that it should be called the Jesuit treason. Edward Cook said that the plotters, and please forgive me, this is pretty graphic, would be drawn backwards to his death by a horse, his head near the ground. He was to be, quote, put to death halfway between heaven and earth, as unworthy of both, end quote. His genitals would be cut off and burnt before his eyes, and his bowels and heart then removed. Then he would be decapitated, and the dismembered parts of his body displayed so they might become, quote, prey for the fowls of the air, end quote. The plotters were allowed to speak. Ambrose Rockwood said that Robert Catesby was the one that had got him involved in the plot, and that he loved Robert Catesby above any worldly man. Thomas Winter begged to be hanged for himself and for his brother, so that his brother could be spared, which is personally one of the saddest things that I have ever heard. His brother, Robert Winter, and Thomas Bates begged for mercy. Guy Fawkes played dumb and pleaded not guilty because he said that he didn't know about certain aspects of the indictment. Robert Keyes just accepted his fate. John Grant said that his involvement as, quote, a conspiracy intended but never effected, end quote. Ever Digby was tried separate, and he pleaded guilty. He said that James had reneged on his promises to be tolerant of Catholics, and that his affection of Robert Catesby and his love for the Catholic cause mitigated his actions. He wanted his execution to be decapitation. He begged for mercy from the king for his family. All of the plotters were found guilty, as I'm sure you've already guessed. They were found guilty of high treason. Ever Digby shouted, quote, if I may but hear any of your lordships say you forgive me, I shall go more cheerfully to the gallows, end quote. They replied with, quote, God forgive you, and we do. End quote. When Henry Garnet was questioned, he was threatened with the rack, and his response was, "Threats are only for boys," which is such a badass response. He denied having anything to do with the plot, and that he encouraged Catholics to pray for the success of the Catholic cause. While he was in jail, they let Henry talk to other priests so they could eavesdrop on his conversations. He admitted that he knew about the plot. Under torture, he told authorities that Oswald Tresimond told him about the plot and Robert Catesby. Henry was charged with high treason and tried on March 28, 1606. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Henry spent 3 months in the Tower of London before he was executed. On May 3rd, 1606, he was strapped to a wooden hurdle and taken by 3 horses to the churchyard of St. Paul's. When he got there, he said that he had nothing to say when he was asked if he knew of other treasons. He also refused to convert to Protestantism, and he said that he committed no offense against the king. He said the only thing that he might be condemned for was for abiding the terms of the confessional, and if that offended the king or state, then he asked for forgiveness. The recorder announced that this was him admitting that he was guilty, but Henry said that he was not guilty and continued to argue his point. Henry mounted a ladder after stripping down to his sewn-up shirt, and then he was thrown off of it. There were many people in the crowd that grabbed Henry's legs and pulled, so they spared him the fate of having to live through being drawn and quartered. So he died by the hanging. No one cheered and applauded when the executioner held up Henry's heart and said, "Behold the heart of a traitor." His head was put on a pole on London Bridge, but the head was soon turned upwards, so his face was no longer visible because his face looked fresh and people were fascinated by it. And I'm almost sure something like that happened in another episode of this podcast. I'm pretty sure it was in season 1. I think it was either Thomas More or the John Fisher episode. Before Henry was executed, the plotters were executed first. On January 30th, 1606, Edward Digby, Robert Winter, John Grant, and Thomas Bates were dragged through the streets of London just like Henry was, and they were taken to St. Paul's churchyard. I will warn you, this next part is graphic. The men were hanged and were quickly cut down. While the men were still alive and fully conscious, the men were castrated, disemboweled, and then quartered. Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy's bodies were dug up and they were decapitated, and their heads were put on spikes outside of the House of Lords. The next day, January 31st, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rockwood, Robert Keyes, and Guy Fawkes were executed. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered opposite the building that they were going to blow up in the old palace yard at Westminster. Robert had hoped to avoid his agonizing death. He jumped from the gallows before the hangman's command. He survived the jump, though, and he was sent to the quartering block. Guy did the same as Robert, but he managed to break his neck and avoid being alive for the most gruesome part of his execution. Stephen Littleton was executed at Stafford sometime in 1606. I couldn't find out how he was executed, but I assume he was also hanged, drawn, and quartered, since everyone else that had anything to do with the plot or helping out the plotters were hanged, drawn, and quartered. It is possible that Robert Cecil may have been involved in the plot. He may have done this to gain favor with James and to pass more anti-Catholic laws. Father John Gerald wrote What Was the Gunpowder Plot, and he alleged that Robert had had a hand in it, though there is no evidence of this. After all of this was discovered, new anti-Catholic laws were passed. The Gunpowder Plot may have inspired William Shakespeare's play Macbeth, so that is at least 2 times William was inspired by James's life. It may have also inspired John Middleton's Paradise Lost. The Gunpowder Plot has been commemorated for years. At first, it was commemorated by special sermons and ringing of church bells. Now there is a thing in Great Britain called Bonfire Night. It started off as Guy Fawkes Night, and it is now known as Bonfire Night. It is on November 5th, and it celebrates the failure of the plot. There is a bonfire and fireworks, and an effigy of Guy Fawkes is burned. Even though these events took place over 4 centuries ago, you may have seen Guy Fawkes, or you may have seen a depiction of him. His depiction was used for the Guy Fawkes mask. That is the mask used in V for Vendetta and the mask used by the hacker group Anonymous. In May of 1606, Parliament passed the Popish Recusants Act. This stripped away a lot of the rights of Roman Catholics. They were not allowed to pursue careers in law or medicine anymore. They also could no longer be guardians or trustees. This also allowed magistrates to search their homes for any arms. This, of course, was a reaction to the Gunpowder Plot. This act denied the Pope the power to dispose of monarchs. The recusant was to be fined £60 or forfeit 2/3 of his land if he didn't receive the sacrament of the Lord's Supper at least once a year in his Church of England parish church. It also made it high treason to obey the Pope instead of the King. Catholics actually had to swear allegiance to James over the Pope. This was called the Oath of Allegiance or the Oath of Obedience. The oath became law on June 22nd, 1606. James didn't have a problem if you were Catholic as long as you were secret about it. You could be a Catholic in private, but to the outside world, you had to be a Protestant. There were even members of his court that he knew were Catholic, and he was completely cool with them as long as they pretended to be Protestant. Like, Henry Howard was a Catholic. I mentioned him last week, and I told you that he was a supporter of James's. At first, James was strict with the new religious changes, like the millenary petition of 1603 that demanded the abolition of infant baptism, wedding rings, and the term priests. But as James's reign went along, he became less and less concerned with enforcing these changes. In 1607, a man by the name of Robert Carr participated in a jousting match that James attended. During the match, Robert fell off of his horse and he broke his leg. This got the attention of James, and he nursed Robert back to health. James grew close to Robert, and Robert became one of James's favorites and probably his lover. It was reported that James would pinch Robert's cheeks, smooth his garments, and look at him adoringly. Robert was young. He was about 19 years old at the time. James was 41. Robert was not known for his intellect, but he was known for his good looks. James invested in improving Robert's education. Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, claimed that James himself taught Robert Latin. He also knighted Robert, and he made him the 1st Earl of Somerset. When Sir Walter Raleigh was found guilty of high treason, he forfeited Sherborne Castle. The castle was supposed to go to Walter's oldest son, but James gave it to Robert instead. Walter's wife, Elizabeth Throckmorton, wasn't even given adequate compensation. Throughout history, there have been many favorites of a king or a queen that have held real power. I have already discussed some on this podcast, and Robert Carr was definitely one of those favorites that held a lot of power. Robert persuaded James to dissolve Parliament in 1610. More on that in a little bit. On March 24th, 1611, Robert was made Viscount Rochester and a Privy Councillor. So, like I said in one of the episodes that I did on James before this one, James was terrible with money, and inflation was not helping out with his money problems. So, Robert Cecil came up with a scheme. The scheme was known as the Great Contract. This plan was thought up to get rid of James's massive debt. Robert Cecil proposed that Parliament give James an annual income. In exchange, the Crown would give up its deeply hated right to make wards of underage heirs of landowners and sell control of their estates to the highest bidder. Parliament wasn't really thrilled with this idea, but they did accept it, though they offered far less money than what Robert Cecil was hoping for. He was hoping for £200,000. This plan never came to be because Parliament members learned that their constituents were not happy about this deal, and James didn't really think that it would help him out, so it didn't go forward. This led to James dissolving Parliament on December 31st, 1610. Second Parliament was formed on April 5th, 1614. This was also known as the Parliament of 1614 or Addled Parliament. It only lasted until June 7th, 1614. This was not even really seen as a parliament because they passed no bills. James did not have a parliament again until 1621. In 1604, James authorized the translation of a book that is in millions of homes across the world, and that is the Bible. King James VI and First is the King James, as in the King James Bible. This version of the Bible has become the most famous Bible. Before the King James version of the Bible existed, there were many different versions of the Bible, many of them contradicting each other. So what was happening is the Bible that people were hearing read in church was different than the Bible they were reading at home. So James wanted there to be one Bible. This was not a small undertaking. The Bible was being translated from its original languages into English. This took 47 scholars, linguists, and theologians 7 years to complete. Before the King James Bible was completed in 1611, the most popular Bible among Protestants was the Geneva Bible, but that Bible was problematic to James. That Bible questioned the power of the bishop. A Puritan scholar was the one that suggested to James that a new translation of the Bible should be created. When it was published, the King James Bible spread throughout not only England, but all of Europe. The fact that it was written in English meant that many could read the Bible for themselves. They didn't have to rely on the church to tell them what the Bible said. And printing had already been invented, so that meant that people could read the Bible in their own homes. The way the Bible was written, with its poetic cadences and vivid imagery, it sounded to many like it was God that was speaking. The King James Bible was influential in the spread of Protestantism. The creation of the King James Bible is one of James's biggest claims to fame, but it also posed a problem. People now had access to some passages that were not read in church, passages that called into question the power of the king. This Bible also did not help settle the religious turmoil that was going on in England, religious turmoil that would eventually lead into a civil war, but that would be a problem for James's son Charles to deal with. Even after all these centuries, the King James Bible is still the most popular version of the Bible, and its impact has not only been to religion, but it has had an effect on art, culture, and common everyday phrases. Robert Cecil died on May 24th, 1612. James's government went into a decline after Robert's death. After Robert's death, James got it in his head that he could be his own minister of state, and Robert Carr took on a lot of Robert Cecil's old duties. This didn't go over too well, and it caused the government to be divided into factions. But it wouldn't be too long before the king's favorite, Robert Carr, would fall out of favor with the king. So, during this time, the Howards had a lot of control in government. When I say the Howards, I mean Henry Howard, 1st Earl of Northampton, Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, Charles Howard, 1st Earl of Nottingham, William Knowles, 1st Earl of Banbury, and Thomas Lake. Thomas Howard had a daughter named Frances Howard. Frances fell in love with Robert Carr. Robert had a friend named Thomas Overbury. Thomas was a writer that became Robert's secretary. Thomas was a supportive character working behind the scenes. With Thomas's help, Robert became very influential at court. Robert helped the Howards gain more power within the government because he was having an affair with Frances. Robert and Frances wanted to be married. There was just a teensy tiny little problem. And that problem was Frances was already married to a man named Robert Devereux. Robert Devereux was the son of another Robert Devereux. And that Robert Devereux number 1, was the Robert Devereux that was once a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. I mentioned him on her episode. Robert Devereux number 2 married Frances when he was 13 years old and Frances was 14. After they were married, they were kept apart for a few years so they wouldn't consummate their marriage, and Frances would get pregnant before her young body could handle a pregnancy and birth. Robert Devereux had been touring Europe, and when he returned to England, Frances made sure that they were never alone together so they couldn't consummate their marriage. Because they had never consummated their marriage, that gave Frances the idea that she could get an annulment and marry Robert Carr. Thomas was not a fan of Frances. Thomas didn't like Frances's reputation. Frances liked to wear plunging necklines. I will be posting a picture of her in a video on TikTok tomorrow so you can see. Frances and Thomas became enemies. Thomas did everything he could to get between Frances and Robert Carr. He even wrote a poem called The Wife, or sometimes it's called A Wife. And it was about what a wife should be. What he described as the ideal wife was the opposite of what Frances was. He was jealous of the attention that Robert was giving Frances and the Howard family. Thomas also tried to get in the way of Frances and Robert Devereux's annulment. So Frances and her family got together, and they started plotting for a way to get Thomas to commit treason. And Anne of Denmark may have even had a little hand in this as well. So here was their plan. The Howards had convinced James to offer Thomas the post of ambassador to Russia. They knew that Thomas would not want this post because they knew that he would not want to be separated from Robert. So when James offered him this job, he turned it down. This pissed off James, and he charged Thomas with treason. Now, I say pissed in quotation marks because James wasn't really pissed that Thomas turned the job down. He actually liked the fact that he could now charge Thomas with treason because he was jealous of Thomas's relationship with Robert Carr. Thomas was arrested and taken to the Tower of London on April 22nd, 1613. Thomas spent about 5 months in the Tower of London, and then he died on September 14th, 1613. Frances got her annulment just 11 days later on September 25th. The grounds for the annulment was Frances claimed that Robert Devereux was impotent. So that meant that Frances had to prove that she was still a virgin. But she wasn't. She had been sleeping with Robert Carr. Frances had to be examined by 10 matrons and 2 midwives to verify whether or not her hymen was still intact. They found that she was still a virgin. It was widely believed that how she managed to pull that off was she swapped places with a virginal doppelganger. Frances had requested that she had her head covered during her examination for modesty reasons, of course. Robert Devereux was like, "Nope, I am not impotent. I have had sex with lots of women. I just can't get it up for Frances because she is mean and ugly." He even had one of his friends say that they had seen him with an erection. The judges started to wonder if Satanism was involved, and they thought that they may have to send Robert off to Poland for an exorcism. At first, the verdict on the annulment was 5-5, so James appointed 2 extra commissioners that he knew would rule in favor of the annulment. Thomas Bilson was one of the added commissioners, and when his son, who was also named Thomas Bilson, was knighted, he was given the nickname Sir Nulty Bilson. 2 months later, after the annulment, Francis and Robert Carr were married. Everything was going good for Francis and Robert Carr, until 2 years later, when the governor of the Tower of London sent a letter to James telling him that Thomas did not die of natural causes. Thomas had been given poisoned food and medicine by one of the warders. In the summer of 1615, a Yorkshire apothecary's assistant was on his deathbed. On his deathbed, he made a confession that Frances Howard had paid him £20 to supply her with poisons so she could murder Thomas. Frances was put on trial, and during this trial, it was revealed how she managed to kill Thomas after he had been locked away in the Tower of London. So Frances had removed the Lord Lieutenant of the Tower of London, and she replaced him with a man that she could use. That man was Gervase Helwas. She also had a second man on the inside. His name was Richard Weston. He was Thomas's jail concierge because even though Thomas was in jail, he was still elite, so he got special treatment. The other players involved were Anne Turner. She was an owner of a brothel, and more importantly, she was the wife of a physician, so she could provide Francis with drugs. And the last player on this team was Simon Franklin. He was the apothecary. When Secretary of State Sir Ralph Winwood brought this to the attention of James, he told Ralph that he wanted this investigated. But what else was he going to say? The investigation ended with Francis and Robert Carr being put on trial in October of 1615. And one of Francis's and Robert Carr's jurors just happened to be Francis's once husband, Robert Devereux. The trial revealed that Francis smuggled poisoned jellies and tarts into the jail for Thomas to eat. Richard Weston told Gervase Helwas that Francis had bribed him to poison Thomas. So Gervase stopped all of the poisoned goodies from getting to Thomas, and he prepared Thomas's food in his own private kitchen. But he didn't tell anyone because he knew how powerful Francis was, and Francis's great uncle Henry Howard was his patron. Francis then managed to smuggle an enema laced with mercury chloride that she got from Anne Turner into the jail. Francis pled guilty, but Robert Carr claimed that he was innocent. James started to worry for his lover. He knew that if Francis and Robert were found guilty, they could be sentenced to death. There was no way that Robert Devereux was going to pass up the opportunity to put to death the woman that called him impotent and her husband. James was also worried for himself. He was worried that Robert Carr might implicate him in the murder. So James sent a bunch of messages telling Robert to plead guilty, and then James told him that he would pardon him. Both Francis and Robert were found guilty. Robert never did change his plea. Francis was found guilty of murder, and Robert was found guilty for being an accessory after the fact. At first, they both were sentenced to death, but it was reduced to life imprisonment in the Tower of London on James's orders. Then James pardoned them. Francis was released from the Tower in January of 1622, and Robert was released in 1624. Gervase Helwas, Richard Weston, Anne Turner, and Simon Franklin were all hanged. You can only get away with murder if you are the king's favorite. There was another person that was arrested in connection with Thomas's murder, and that was Sir Thomas Munson. He was Gervase Helwas' patron, but the prosecution ended up dropping his charges. Francis and Robert retired from the public, but the murder followed them everywhere they went. Francis's annulment and Thomas's murder was the subject of many plays, poems, and things like that. Thomas's poem, A Wife, became super popular. It never went out of print for the next 60 years. Robert, retiring from the public life, left the door open for someone else to come in and be the king's favorite and lover. But more on him next week. James's reputation was also tarnished by this murder. There were people that believed that he had a hand in Thomas's murder. And side note, Robert Devereux went on to marry again, but he never did father any children. So maybe Frances wasn't lying when she said that Robert Devereux couldn't get it up. And that's where I'm going to stop this episode. So there will be a King James the 6th and 1st part 4. I promise I do have other people that I'm going to talk about this season. I just need to stop this episode here, and there's still more that I need to tell you about James. So next week when I start the episode, I'm going to tell you about a plan that James came up with to help him out with his massive debt. So thank you so much for listening to the 7th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I'm going to cover 15 people this season, and who knows how many episodes that's going to be. Next week's episode is going to be King James the 6th and 1st part 4. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is History Shelf, the Twitter is at History Shelf Pod, the Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help support this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store. You can also become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of each episode, I will give you a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier. Plus, you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers. Plus, you will get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you can choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up pudding. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. There are also affiliated links for Riverside, Amazon, and Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch and you don't want any of the perks and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support this podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next week, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.